Good morning, colleagues. We're going to get underway. We've got another fantastic series of speakers and concurrent sessions, workshops put together by you, our members, during the course of the day. And for those of you that weren't at our dinner last night, just to update you that with the ACFID Awards, the Australians Amanda Hodge won the ACFID Media Award for her coverage of the Rohingya, the plight of the Rohingya people on the Burma-Bangladesh border. Rhonda Chapman, Rhonda, are you here? No, but Rhonda Chapman, who's known to many of us in our sector, won the Contribution to the Sector Award. And the winner of the 2018 Sir Ronald Wilson Human Rights Award went to Bahruz Bachani, the Kurdish journalist and human rights activist held in Manus Island Detention Centre, whose your writings you've seen in The Guardian. So a few quick housekeeping announcements. So all the program is on your conference app, and if you have any problems with the app, please speak to people at registration. And do go and meet with our sponsors who support our conference but also help keep the registration fees down. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the day, the remarkable Indigenous human rights activist and environmental defender, Joan Carling. Joan, would you please come up and join us on the stage? And Joan is born in the Philippines, in the northern Luzon, in the Cordillera region. She has been defending land rights from the grassroots activist level for many years, and then moved internationally in terms of her advocacy, and has been very involved in working with Australians like the Indigenous human rights activist Les Malsa in helping create what became the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People at the United Nations. She has advocated on sustainable development of natural resources. She's got particularly a lot of experience working with mining companies, and we know that Australian mining companies are prevalent around the world. And she is also been a very powerful advocate, and not without risk to her own life. And of course, I think it was last year's conference, Joan, we moved a motion condemning the Duterte government's extrajudicial killings of citizens, Filipino citizens. So it's a great honour to have you here. She is now on the UN Economic and Social Council as an Indigenous expert, and has served on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues between 2014 and 16. And most recently, she just got a gong, which is the United Nations Champions of the Earth Award for Lifetime Achievement. So we're really honoured to have you here today. Thank you.
Let me first pay my greetings to the owner of the traditional lands where we are in, and to give my warmest solidarity greetings and salutations to the Indigenous peoples of Australia who continue their quest for social justice, equality, and dignity. For Indigenous peoples, the protection of human rights and the environment, as well as the achievement of sustainable development, are all interlinked. When we speak of human rights, we refer to both individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Our right to our land is also our right to life. Our right to our culture is also our right to our identity. Our right to self-determination is our right to liberty and freedom. We are not just individuals, but peoples who have chosen to persist with our own culture, identities, and ways of life rooted in our lands, territories, and resources, which makes us different from the mainstream society and are marginalized and or forcibly assimilated in the establishment of nation states. We carry with us the obligation of nurturing our environment for the future generations. We uphold reciprocity in our relations with nature and the spirit of solidarity and respect in our relation with others. Development for us needs to respect these relations and uphold our dignity and our roles and contributions as stewards of our natural resources. Allow me then to share with you my journey as an indigenous activist. I started when I was 18 years old at college during the time of martial law in the Philippines. I spent some time in the tribal villages of Kalinga, which has successfully resisted the Chico dams that had threatened to submerge their villages, rice fields, and livelihoods of more than 1,000 indigenous peoples. I have witnessed how they value their cooperation and harmony, their simple life, and their unwavering commitment to protect the river and their lands for the future generation. Their leaders were killed, and hundreds of them were put in jail during their struggle, yet they remained strong and vigilant. Their resistance to the dam projects and to the commercial logging operations started the Cordillera movement for the defense of ancestral lands and for self-determination. My immersion with these tribes made me strengthen my indigenous identity and resolve to work for the cause of indigenous peoples as stewards of the environment we all depend on. I went back to the same province in Kalinga and worked there for 3 years when the villages were subjected to intense militarization in the government's all-out war against insurgents. It was heartbreaking for me to see the look of fear, anger, and helplessness in the eyes of villagers whose houses were burnt down to the ground. I had to negotiate with the military leaders to allow the villagers to harvest their crops as they were forbidden to leave their village. I spearheaded fact-finding missions to investigate abuses of military and paramilitary forces in remote villages. In one occasion, we were detained for 1 day by a despotic mayor who was in connivance with the military. Another mission we did was a case of indiscriminate firing of soldiers, leading to the wounding of several villagers and the destruction of their properties in a far-flung village. It was another intense encounter with the military as they surrounded us with their guns, pointed on us, and accused us of being rebel supporters, and refused to compensate for the damages in the houses and properties of the villages. When I joined a conference on militarization and ethnocide in Mindanao, that's the south of the country, we were all arrested and detained for 16 days under the charge of subversion, which was scrapped. It was another nightmare for me, and I ended up in the hospital due to malaria. It was the moment in my life when I realized the value of freedom as a matter of right and that we should not take it for granted. If you see yourself behind the bars, then that's the time that you realize the freedom of each person matters. These were the experiences that have tempered me as a human rights activist and deepened my commitment to work with and be the voice of those who do not have access to the powers that be, to the media, and to the public. When I was elected as the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous the Cordillera Peoples Alliance in 1998, It was the time of mining disasters and the implementation of the liberalization of the mining industry in the Philippines. The Cordillera region, where I come from, is a gold-rich area which attracted the Spanish colonizers and later the Americans that started commercial mining in the Philippines in the late 1800s. I was then occupied with visiting mining-affected communities and giving environment and indigenous people's rights education, strengthening their organizations, and engaging in dialogues, along with local leaders, with officials of mining companies, with dam builders, with the private sector, and local governments. It was a thoroughgoing work in strengthening our movement, and we were gaining ground in stopping the exploration activities of at least 100 mining applications. Then, the situation has changed when we, the leaders of the movement, were targeted for extrajudicial killings. 4 of my colleagues were killed. One of those was my housemate when I was working in the province. I was also facing threats to my life. My house was broken into, and I was followed by suspicious-looking men in motorcycles. I was able to move around only with a bodyguard. It was a difficult time for me, as I also had to care for the families of my colleagues. Every political killing leaves families and relatives behind. And who are going to take care of them? So we're not talking of only individuals. We're talking of families and tribes and clans who have lost their leaders. I took a break as an Oak Human Rights Fellow in the US for 6 months in 2006, and then continued my work as human rights activist with the Cordillera Human Rights Alliance. Now I want to show, where, sorry. Okay. I want to show the situation where that I'm talking about. This is in the south of the country, where you can see where our territories are, of which our biodiversity, including minerals, are found, and where military deployment is happening. And so you can just imagine the kind of political repression and human rights abuses that are taking place. This is a more recent one. If you look at the military deployment, it's around 50,000 soldiers. And this is only in the south of the country who are now under this kind of situation. So these are the photos of those who were forcibly evacuated because of military operation. And they just have to pick whatever they can because the bombings started in their villages. This is an area for mining, but including Australian mining. And this is the territory of indigenous peoples. These are the mining companies. Okay, and finally, just to show that people refuse to be silenced, we are taking a stand and we are fighting back. Just to continue my journey, when I was elected as the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and based in Thailand from 2008 to 2016. I worked with indigenous organizations and communities across 13 countries in Asia. I have visited communities in Cambodia whose farms were taken over by French agribusiness company and mining company who informed communities to better accept the unjust payment of their land or will not receive any compensation as the government has given them the lease to do their business operations. These communities have already filed their claim for community land titles under the Community Land Act. In Lao PDR, indigenous peoples known as ethnic groups were forced to relocate to give way to large dam constructions, even if there were no livelihoods provided to them and their housing were inappropriate. In Indonesia and Malaysia, the massive expansion of palm oil plantations is destroying the indigenous people's sustainable food systems and traditional institutions. In India, displacements of Adivasi communities from mining have further impoverished them. These are a few examples that mirror the struggles of indigenous peoples across Asia and beyond. The impacts of these projects are not only physical displacements, but the destruction of the material base of our cultures, identities, spirituality, traditional institutions, knowledge, and well-being. It has certainly disempowered our communities, including women. Too often, when we defend our lands and resources, harassment, intimidation, arrest and detention, and even extrajudicial killings are the responses of states. Based on the report of Global Witness, at least 207 land and environmental activists were killed in 2017 across 22 countries, almost 4 a week, marking it the worst year on record. A total of 48 recorded deaths took place in the Philippines, and it was in that area that I showed you, the highest for an Asian country. Most victims are indigenous leaders, community activists, and environmentalists murdered for trying to protect their homes and communities from mining, agribusiness, and other destructive industries. What has been repeatedly been used to justify the violations of human rights of indigenous activists and others is the implementation of national security laws or anti-terrorist laws, which is discriminatory and a tool to silence dissent. This is now the legal weapon of states like in the Philippines, Colombia, India, Chile, Honduras, among others, which they claim is part of the rule of law to maintain peace. I myself is accused as a terrorist by the present authoritarian government in the Philippines, along with other 35 indigenous leaders in a list of 600 so-called terrorists under the Human Security Act. Further, trumped-up charges such as murder, robbery, illegal possession of firearms are now used to arrest and detain indigenous leaders in the Philippines, Guatemala, and others. These actions are meant to cripple indigenous organizations and movements, instill fear to indigenous communities, and project indigenous peoples to the general public as the enemies of the people. On top of this, hundreds of indigenous peoples are criminalized and put in jail for practicing their traditional livelihoods, which are prohibited by law, such as shifting cultivation and rotational agriculture, gathering of non-timber forest products, cutting of wood for building their house, fishing, among others. In Thailand, 2 poor Karen indigenous peoples were arrested and charged with causing global warming by burning part of their forest rice fields. and had to pay a bail bond of around $5,000 each. In Indonesia, more than 200 villagers are in jail, facing unjust and discriminatory charges. Then why are we, indigenous peoples, being targeted with political repression? It is because we continue to assert and defend our lands, territories, and resources, and much of this are now the only remaining global resources that are aimed for further exploitation in the name of development or for fortress conservation. Land grabbing of indigenous territories for mining, agribusiness, real estate, national parks, and conservation areas have intensified in both developed and developing countries. These are also violating the requirement for the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. Indigenous women are disproportionately impacted by the destruction of our lands and resources. They are largely the food producers and traditional knowledge holders, including traditional plants for medicines, which are severely affected by land grabbing. Likewise, they become more vulnerable to violence and all forms of abuse when they are not within their territories. The social cohesion of indigenous communities, including maintaining peace, of which women play a critical role, are compromised or weakened when indigenous peoples are removed from their territories. While there are national laws in several countries such as India, Malaysia, Cambodia, Philippines, on the recognition on the collective land rights of indigenous peoples, the implementation is problematic. Either the customary lands are being reduced in size for actual recognition, or these are more individual land and not as collective ownership, leading to further dispossession as individuals are subjected to intimidation and harassment to sell off their lands. Again, indigenous women are even more disempowered as individual lands are put in the name of their husband or son. However, what needs to be stressed is that indigenous women have more secure land rights under the recognition and security of collective land ownership, and within this, they should also be entitled to their individual land as their property rights. While we are now on the 11th year of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that include the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples to our land, territories, and resources, including to free, prior, and informed consent, there remains a huge gap in the implementation and the realization of these collective rights. While we are 5% of the global population, we comprise 15% of the global poor, in spite of all the development projects in our territories. While we claim 60% of the global land base, only 10% is legally recognized. Further, 60 to 80% of the remaining global biodiversity are found in indigenous territories, but our conservation and sustainable management of resources are not acknowledged, recognized, and protected, and we are even criminalized as destroyers of biodiversity. As the global community has now embarked and made commitment to the ambitious development goals, also called as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, this provides risks and also opportunities for indigenous peoples. The SDG calls for balanced implementation of the economic, social, and environment dimensions of development. It is underpinned by the realization of human rights, includes data disaggregation by gender, age, ethnicity, and persons with disabilities, and calls for leaving no one behind and partnerships to achieve the goals. These are all positive principles and commitments, but are still lacking in concrete and transformational actions to achieve the goals. Given that the SDGs is based on voluntary commitment, the business-as-usual approach to development, anchored in perpetuating capitalist system, lack of accountability, transparency remain prevalent in majority of the SDG national action plans, as well as in the public-private partnerships to support the implementation of the SDGs. In my engagement with the SDG processes at the regional and global levels, human rights are hardly mentioned. When I attended the expert meeting on Goal 2, Ending Hunger, the top UN officials who gave the opening remarks did not even mention the right to food. When we are requesting a number of member states to include the need for the protection of human rights and the collective rights of indigenous peoples in the ministerial declaration of the high-level political forum, which is the global review process of the SDGs, they told us that the SDGs is for development and that human rights is being addressed in the Human Rights Council. While 92% of the SDG targets are fully aligned to human rights, the recommendations of treaty bodies and UPR are clearly linked to the SDGs, but are not integrated in the implementation of the SDG national action plans and targets. This is obviously a clear attempt by many states and other development actors, such as the private sector, to delink human rights from SDGs. Given going back to the reality of the worsening human rights violations with impunity and the widening inequality and lack of social justice, we need to reclaim power as citizens and demand accountability or make states to account. We need to support community actions, strengthen social movements in every country, and build our broadest solidarity and sustained actions to end impunity and pursue our path to sustainable development by protecting the only planet we have. As a lifetime activist, I always believe and trust that our future remains in our hands and we should never be silenced. There is always hope in working together. Complacency in this time of crisis is not in my vocabulary. Thank you.
Joan, thank you for your courage and your powerful advocacy and your eloquence this morning. We have time for two well-chosen questions to Joan. Who would like to ask about SDGs, the rights of Indigenous people, corporate responsibility and rights? Don't be shy.
Wow.
Yes, Helen.
Thanks very much for that presentation, and obviously around the world we're concerned about what's happening as we are in our own country in relation to the rights of Indigenous people. Given what's happening in the Philippines at the moment, I just wonder if there is any potential for the private sector to be anything closer to an ally, given that the government is clearly so, well, awful, if you don't mind me saying, and you know, whether some of the work that I guess allies in other countries like Australia and organisations like my own, which is Oxfam, can be doing to try to build a better understanding of the rights of Indigenous people and the responsibilities, particularly of overseas countries when they come into companies, when they come into your countries like yours to benefit from resources and so on.
Okay, that's quite a set of questions, but in relation, I think, to what the private sector can do, I've been reaching out as well. In fact, the Investors Alliance for Human Rights came out with a strong statement denouncing the actions of the Philippine government in terms of the extrajudicial killings and the terrorist list. And my sense is that it's it's the private sector who are working with the different government agencies, right? And by working with the different government agencies, they can exert their pressure to these agencies. It's quite difficult to deal with the president directly because, you know, I don't have to say it. But by putting pressure to those who are actually implementing things on the ground, that can create, they will feel the impact if, say, investors would threaten to pull out or something to that effect, then they will try to make the higher-ups know that there is pressure creeping in, that even the private sector is rethinking about their investment. In fact, there's a decline of foreign investment in the country. But the serious concern that we have is that China is coming in big time. And that is not just in the Philippines, but in the different parts of the indigenous territories, Africa and Latin America. And that is something that we need to address, because they don't even care about human rights to begin with. And what can others do? Like, for example, Oxfam. We acknowledge the support that we have actually received from Oxfam and other international organizations. And this has generated a lot of attention in the country, and with the mindset of the general public. Because what we need to influence is not just the government, but also the general public. We need to get their support. We need to also get their concern. So that because fake news is prevalent. And if the fake news is the ones that the people will believe, they really think that I am terrorists, right? Because that's what the government is saying. And so we need to get into the public debate in using media, using social media to generate that this is something that the public should be concerned of and need to take action and to take action on.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately we're out of time, but Joan is going to be with us for the rest of the day. So please give her a big warm thank you.